John Wyclif, I will not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord. February 1377, London, England. The setting sun cast a fiery glow on the surface of Thames. Dozens of people hastened along the road south of London, most trying to get back to the city before curfew. Among the few going back the other direction was a frail man with a long white beard. The cold air made his nose drip onto his whiskers, and he swiped at them with the tattered sleeve of his robe. It had snowed briefly the day before, and now the ruts in the cobbled streets overflowed with muddy slush. Hobbling barefoot, he did his best to avoid the puddles, but the traffic was unkind. Carriage wheels rumbled behind him, and he cringed even before the dark, icy spray rained down on him. He wiped his face with his sleeve again, but it was too damp to do any good. With a low "Whoa" from the driver, the horses pulled back, and the carriage jerked to a stop a few paces ahead of him. The door swung open. "Dr. Wyclif!" cried a woman's voice. He recognized the carriage then, and bent himself into a deep bow before the open door. "Look at you! You're covered with mud. I am so sorry, doctor. My driver should have been more careful." He raised his eyes. The most beautiful woman in all of England was leaning out the door. Her lips curved into an apologetic smile. "Princess Joanne, it is always a pleasure to meet you, no matter the circumstances." She laughed at him and reached out a gloved hand. "I assume you are on your way to Savoy Palace. Come, ride with me the rest of the way." He let her pull him inside and tuck a heavy fur around him on the leather seat. The carriage lurched into motion again, rocking him against the satin draperies. It was much warmer in here than in the street. "You must be a guest at the Duke's dinner party," she exclaimed. "I am so glad. A party in my honor will be much more interesting in the company of the illustrious Oxford doctor." "You are too kind, Princess," he insisted. "The honor is mine." She leaned against the cushions and laughed again. Bundled into her furs, only her head was exposed, but it was clear why she was known throughout England as the Fair Maid of Kent. She had the complexion of a porcelain doll, a shapely nose, a pair of delicately arched brows. Her green eyes sparkled like the jewels in her gold circlet. Below the crown, her famous auburn hair was twisted into twin coils above her ears and covered with fine netting. "I must say, however, that you do not look the role, Dr. Wyclif. A lecturer with no shoes must cause a stir at the university." He batted a hand at her teasing. "They're used to my non-traditional attire. A priest must live simply. I say, I would not trade the riches of Christ for all the riches of the world." "So you are still causing trouble, then?" "If preaching the truth causes trouble, so be it." But he smiled. "How is young Richard?" "My son is healthy, thanks be to God, but he misses his father." A shadow flitted across her face. "It has been over 6 months now." "All of England misses the Black Prince, my lady." They paused at the huge iron gates of the Savoy, and waited for the Duke's guards to swing them inside. The driver clucked at the horses again, and they pulled down the neat row of barren trees and into the circled drive, stopping before the massive wooden doors. "Until dinner, then?" she said, as Wyclif helped her down to the waiting footman. She was whisked into the palace. The old man climbed down and followed with considerably less ceremony. The corridors were full of clerks concluding the Duke of Lancaster's business for the day. They nodded at Wyclif. He was a friend of the Duke's and a frequent guest. In the great hall he paused before a portrait of the Duke. It was framed in hand-carved molding that had been rubbed with gold. The artist had captured the Duke's intelligent eyes, long nose, and neatly trimmed beard. His arms and legs displayed lustrous armor under a black and red tunic bearing his coat of arms, and he wore a gold crown. It was a good likeness. He continued to the dining hall, pausing at the entrance while he was announced. The custom was too formal for him, but he had no intention of insulting his hosts. "John Wyclif, priest of Lutterworth and Oxford doctor of theology," cried the herald. He went in. Red walls rose from the checkered floor to the gilded ceiling. Harp and lute players strummed quietly in a low balcony at the far end of the room. The coat of arms was repeated here, a large display in the center of the main wall. It was a quartered royal shield. The upper right and lower left corners of the shield depicted 3 lions of England bearing their claws. The upper left and lower right corners contained the traditional fleur-de-lis of France. It had been the proud shield of the Duke's family since his father, King Edward III of England, had claimed the French throne 40 years ago. A number of guests had already arrived. They mingled in their bright clothes around a massive table, elegantly set for a crowd. Among the guests he recognized Sir Henry Percy, the new Marshal of England, and William Courtenay, London's popular young bishop. A servant showed him to a seat near the center of the table. "No," Wyclif shook his head. "I'm sure this is not my seat." He knew seating was based on rank, and with this guest list, he would likely be furthest from the host. "This is the correct seat," insisted the servant. "The princess requested you sit next to her." He waited uncomfortably behind his chair. "Joan of Kent, Princess of Wales." The fair maid swept in as she was announced, bestowing a welcome smile on the whole room. She was still dressed in mourning for her husband, in a black gown with a wide neckline and a sweeping train. Her pointed sleeves, split at the elbows, draped nearly to the floor. She moved gracefully toward Wyclif and leaned in to whisper above the music. "I hope you don't mind entertaining me," she said. "I asked for you to be seated next to me." "It is very kind of you, as usual, but I'm afraid the other guests are less pleased with the arrangement." "You mean Courtenay?" She eyed the bishop, who was frowning in their direction. "He'll get over it." The musicians fell silent then as the hosts entered the doorway. "John of Gaunt, King of Castile and Leon, Duke of Lancaster, Duke of Burgundy, Earl of Lincoln and Leicester, Lord of Beaufort and Nogent of Bergerac, etc., etc. His wife, the Duchess of Lancaster, Constance of Castile." The couple entered to the applause of their guests. Everyone waited until Duke John seated the Duchess on his left, seated the Princess on his right, and then took his own place at the center of the table. Then they scrambled for their seats. Wyclif lowered himself uncomfortably on the edge of his chair next to the Princess. "Welcome," the Duke said, spreading his hands across the table. He wore a white fur collar over a blue velvet jacket, and looked every part the royal English host. "Thank you all for gracing my table tonight." He turned to Joan. "It is a special honor to welcome you, fair princess. Your presence distinguishes this gathering like a rare jewel." "Don't be so formal with your sister-in-law," she laughed and raised her goblet. "To the delicious dinner and fascinating conversation." "Hear, hear!" Duke John waved at the musicians to take up their instruments again, and the butlers began to flit in and out with the first course. Wyclif slurped his soup quietly, listening as the guests struck up clusters of conversation. A lady at the end of the table praised Bishop Courtenay's last sermon. Someone commented on how delightfully the musicians played. The princess and Sir Percy laughed at a story the Duchess told. Duchess Constance turned to him then. "Dr. Wyclif, how delightful that you could join us," she said, her eyes wandering to the mud stains on his brown robe. "Please pardon my appearance," he said. "I preached in 3 churches today, and I'm afraid the streets are a bit messy this winter." "I hear you've been working hard for the Duke these last few months in London." "I have been working hard for the cause of the gospel," he said, softening the rebuke with a smile. The Duke winked at his wife. "The truth is that I am working hard for Dr. Wyclif, rather than the other way around. It is my duty to support forward thinkers like him." The princess chuckled at his elbow. "Especially if his forward thinking keeps more silver in the coffers of England." "That is just a side benefit," said Sir Percy, hiding his grin behind his sleeve as he wiped his mouth. "It is perfectly reasonable that the church reform would have a positive impact on the government of England," Wyclif said, reaching for the salt cellar. "But that is not my purpose. My purpose is to correct the abuses of the church." "What abuses?" The buzz of conversation died away. "The church can't be guilty of abuses," said Bishop Courtenay emphatically. "She is the bride of Christ." "She is no longer the pure bride she once was," replied Wyclif. Courtenay put his elbows on the table and leaned in. "That is a dangerous accusation, Doctor. Tell me, how has the church sullied her reputation?" Wyclif felt all eyes on him. Even the musicians had stopped playing and were peering over the balcony. "God has blessed his church with great wealth," he said. "There are 100 churches in London alone, nearly one on every street. Instead of distributing this wealth to the poor, the bishops spend it on bigger cathedrals." "It is proper to decorate God's house. The Jews melted their gold earrings to build the tabernacle according to God's instructions." "True," admitted Wyclif, "but Jesus said that a cup of cold water given to the thirsty was an act of mercy befitting his gospel. Instead, our church pads her pockets when the poor don't even have pockets." "Jesus also said the poor would always be with us." "He didn't mean not to help them." The Pope demands taxes from the king," broke in Duke John. "But England belongs to Christ, not to the Pope. If the Church of England cares for her own needs, what does she owe the Pope?" "The paying of tithes is a spiritual duty," declared the bishop. Wyclif shook his head. "The less the church is concerned with wealth and power, the more she can fulfill her spiritual duties. And how can she fulfill those duties when her bishops commit sins of gluttony and pride?" Now Courtenay was on his feet. Are you accusing me of those sins? No, said Wyclif sincerely. All of London knows you are a godly man, and no one can rightly accuse you of such things. But that is not true of every bishop. And there are many other things we must change too. We hold our services in Latin. How can the unlearned know anything about their faith when they don't speak Latin? We tell them to love God's word, but we keep it out of the English language. Why can the French have a translation, but the English cannot? If we translate the Scriptures into English, every fool will believe himself a bishop. What heresies will we have on our hands if the Bible is in theirs? We must work harder to teach correct doctrine then. You are unwise to speak so poorly of the Church of God. The Duchess waved flustered hands. I beg your pardon, gentlemen. I'm afraid I started this discussion with my innocent questions. You'll forgive me? I do hope we can finish our dinner in peace. No, you'll forgive me, Duchess, said the bishop, retaking his seat with a regal nod. I did not mean to take advantage of your hospitality. The good doctor and I will have this conversation another time. Yes, today is dedicated to the flower of England, said the Duke, raising his glass toward the princess. Yes, we seem to have forgotten about me, said Joan with another laugh. Ha ha! Where is the next course of this delicious meal? I may have to steal your cooks, Constance. The guests relaxed, and a pleasant murmur of conversation stirred again. The musicians returned to their instruments. Wyclif accepted a piece of broiled fish from a butler and ate hungrily. Bishop Courtenay glared at him for the rest of the evening. As the guests were leaving, the princess pulled Wyclif aside. You are brave to take on the bishop, or the pope, I suppose. You must know they will make trouble for you. I am simply speaking the truth, he said. It is unpleasant, but it must be said. Yes, but be careful. The bishop knows full well what you've been preaching in his city. He's looking for evidence to bring you to trial. The Duke appeared at her side. Courtenay believes you are simply my tool for getting the government more power over the church, he said to Wyclif. The doctor shrugged. If the church won't perform her duties to the people, then it is up to the government to help the people, even if that means taking back the church's funds and property. I agree, said Duke John. That is why I have supported you for the last 5 months. It is not in my best interests to discourage your work, but your position grows more dangerous every day. We must pray harder for our reforms. The truth will not be silenced on my watch. His companions were silent. Then the princess broke into a smile. A thank you for the entertaining battle with the bishop, she said. And now I must pay my respects to our hostess. Good night, Doctor. Good night, John. She swept toward the Duchess at the door. It's late, beyond London's curfew, said the Duke, and you are looking rather tired. You may as well spend the night here. I have a meeting in the city in the morning. You can ride in with me. Very well. I wasn't looking forward to the walk anyway. I'm not as young as I used to be. The Duke laughed. Who is, Doctor? The two of them were in the Duke's private office at the Savoy a week later, when a message arrived for Wyclif. It's a summons from Courtenay, said the doctor. He and Archbishop of Canterbury have called me to stand trial at St. Paul's Cathedral and explain my beliefs. Explain your beliefs? Compared to you, the bishops are practically illiterate, declared the Duke. Courtenay and Archbishop Sudbury are reasonable men. I'm sure we can have a civil discussion. Even so, I suggest we get a few friars to help you with your defense, and it would be a good idea to take the marshal along with us, in case the bishop decides to take action. Word of the summons spread through the city as fast as the plague. On the day of the trial, Duke John accompanied Wyclif to the cathedral. Sir Percy and some of his men went with them. They were surprised to find nearly the whole city waiting for them. "This can't be for me," said Wyclif. "I'm afraid it's my fault," said Percy, keeping his hand on the hilt of his sword. "The people find me a bit heavy-handed with the law. They're here to protest my involvement in church matters." The cathedral was the tallest building in London, and a center for legal transactions. Today there were so many people in the courtyard. Some had even climbed up to St. Paul's Cross, a platform with a giant stone cross where public announcements were often made. Percy's men had to threaten and shove to clear a path into the church and through the long nave to the chapel at the other end. Bishop Courtenay and Archbishop Sudbury were waiting for them at the altar. "If I had known you were bringing an army with you, Lord Percy, I'd have seen to it that you were not invited," declared Courtenay. As many people who could fit had followed them into the chapel. They hooted at the bishop's sharp words. "This is a public building, Courtenay," said the Duke. "Percy has as much right to be here as you do." Percy glared at the bishop and put a firm hand on Wyclif's slight shoulder. "It took a bit of effort to get in here, didn't it, Doctor? I think you should sit down and rest yourself. You don't look well." That launched a new wave of clamor. Nobody was allowed to sit during a trial. "You will remain standing, Doctor," demanded Courtenay. "It is Percy's fault you had such a hard time getting here, not mine." "Percy's motion is reasonable," Duke John insisted, "and I've had enough of your arrogance, Lord Bishop. If I must, I will bring down all the prideful bishops in England." "Do your worst, sir." The crowd pressed forward. The trial had not yet begun, and already it was more entertaining than they had hoped. "You think you cannot be touched because you are a wealthy bishop?" Duke John had his hands on his hips. "My confidence is in nothing but God, with whose assistance I will be bold enough to examine this wayward priest." The Duke turned to Percy. "Perhaps it is time to pluck this bishop from the church like a hare is plucked from a head." The crowd rushed at them. "Keep your hands off our bishop," they shouted. "That's enough," cried Archbishop Sudbury. "This is a church. You are in the presence of God. Come to order." But Courtenay and Sudbury could no longer see Wyclif or his protectors. In the chaos, the trio had slipped out of the cathedral and returned to Savoy Palace. When the crowd realized they were gone, they went home. Percy was right. They hadn't come to see what would befall the frail priest, but to object to the new marshal. Wyclif returned to his teaching at Oxford. Every day in the quiet refectory, he sat on a hard-backed wooden chair facing a row of students. Beside him, a large copy of whatever text they were studying was propped on a stand, so all could see. He lectured for the first hour, then prodded the students to ask and answer questions on the subject. There were several classes a day, scheduled between meals and prayer services. One of his students, John Aston, was so moved by Wyclif's teaching that he insisted on dressing like the doctor. Aston and a fellow student named Nicholas Hereford began helping Wyclif translate the Bible into English. Every day they took the few pages they completed to the scriptorium, where other students copied them and bound the new pages with the previous ones to be distributed in the bookshops of Oxford. 3 significant announcements reached Wyclif at the university that year. In the spring, he learned that Pope Gregory had left Avignon in September and returned the papacy to Rome. Critics had been calling for the return to Rome for years, but it wasn't until the Dominican sister Catherine of Siena urged him that Gregory finally agreed. It had taken months for the word to reach England. Perhaps the move demonstrates that the Pope is open to reform, wondered Wyclif. In June, King Edward III died. England mourned. John of Gaunt was appointed guardian of Prince Richard, Joan's 11-year-old son. Richard was now king, and the Duke was busy handling his affairs. In December, Wyclif's friend, Alan Tonworth, Chancellor of Oxford, brought him a disturbing letter. Wyclif was in the refectory with Aston and Hereford discussing the place of science in theology. "Apparently you have enemies in high places," said Chancellor Tonworth, waving the letter. "Someone sent a list of accusations against you to Rome, and the Pope is furious. He is calling for your imprisonment and trial." "The Pope has no such authority to arrest an Englishman," cried Hereford. "Only the government can put someone in prison." "He's ordered it anyway," said Chancellor Tonworth. "The Pope believes he rules the world." "This is the very abuse of power I've been writing and preaching about," said Wyclif, scowling. "He takes farmland from the poor to build a new cathedral. When the citizens resist, like in Florence, he just sends his mercenaries in to murder them and take it away." Aston began to pace up and down the long hall. "What are you going to do, Chancellor?" "The Pope is threatening to take over Oxford if we don't examine him for heresy," said Tonworth. "Then examine me," Wyclif insisted. "Oxford is capable of identifying truth or heresy without the Pope's threats. Gather all the doctors, and I will explain my views." The examination took place within days. His answers satisfied the other lecturers, but they were hesitant to pick a fight with the Pope. "Perhaps until we sort this out with Rome, you will stay in Black Hall," one of them suggested. "We can assure the Pope we have complied with his arrest order, and you will be a lot more comfortable here than in the Tower of London." Wyclif agreed for their sake, but the solution did not satisfy the bishops of England. Alan Tonworth was fired as Chancellor of Oxford. Wyclif was ordered to appear in March at a new trial in Lambeth Palace, Archbishop Sudbury's castle. From Oxford he was escorted to the Thames to board the Archbishop's barge, and then across to the south bank. The castle towers cast long, rippling shadows on the surface of the river. The mist was cold, and Wyclif shivered, tucking his bare feet under the hem of his robe. Sudbury had a roomy chapel on the second floor of one of the towers. He was waiting with Bishop Courtenay and a number of other English bishops when Wyclif was led upstairs. "Well, Dr. Wyclif, it's time we got back to this trial," Sudbury declared. His colleagues stood on either side of him, resplendent in their embroidered robes and pointed mitres. "John of Gaunt and Henry Percy will not be present today," Courtenay added. "This time there will be no threats or riots to distract us from the pursuit of justice." "I am prepared to defend my teachings," replied Wyclif, facing the bishops. "I preach only what I sincerely believe is the word of God. If you show me where I am wrong, I will repent of my errors and submit to the Church." Courtenay shrugged. "Then this trial need not be long." A list of charges was read. "What do you have to say for yourself?" asked the Archbishop. Wyclif stood tall, though his tired legs were trembling. "Some of these accusations are true. I do believe no one can be excommunicated by the Church who has not first severed himself from God by his sins. I do believe that the state can and must refuse to pay tithes to corrupt bishops. But, he jabbed at the air with his index finger, many of your accusations are unfounded. You have misunderstood my teachings. Enlighten us. I speak the truth when I say that the devil himself reigns among the clergy. They crave power and wealth and will do whatever they can do to keep from being exposed. Words like that will not deliver you from punishment, thundered Sudbury. There was a sudden commotion in the hall outside. A guard slipped in with a whispered message for the archbishop. Sudbury frowned. The council welcomes Sir Lewis Clifford, he said in a voice that did not sound at all welcoming. Wyclif raised a curious eyebrow and turned to the door with the bishops. He had heard of Clifford. He was a distant relative of Princess Joan and had fought in battle with John of Gaunt. The knight marched in, but he was not alone. A crowd of noisy Londoners followed him. At the front were Aston and Hereford. Aston winked at his lecturer. Quiet, Archbishop Sudbury demanded. Sir Clifford stopped a few paces from the bishop, the archbishop, and made a graceful bow. When he drew himself back to his full height, his voice rang through the now packed chapel. I come as an emissary of Joan of Kent, Princess of Wales, to deliver a message to Archbishop Sudbury. Sudbury was still frowning. State your message, knight. You know who I am. The princess has received the Pope's letter asking for her support in the matter of Dr. Wyclif. The Church may pass judgment on Dr. Wyclif as you see fit, she says, but the government will not carry out your sentences. Excommunicate him if you will, but there will be no torture or execution of heretics in England. The crowd broke into shouts and applause. Courtenay pulled the archbishop aside. This is a familiar situation, he warned. Too familiar, nodded Sudbury. We must act quickly. We are about to lose this opportunity as we did the first. But this time these fickle people care what happens to the priest. I will not have a riot in my own home, Courtenay. The archbishop raised his hands to silence the people. Quiet, quiet! He adjusted his robes and faced them calmly. No one will be tortured or executed, he reassured the crowd. However, this council forbids Dr. Wyclif to preach on any of the matters about which he has been examined today. The people stamped and cheered. Sudbury pushed Courtenay out a side exit. Sir Clifford took the frail doctor by the elbow and hurried him out to the barge. A distinctive carriage was waiting at the dock on the other side of the river. Clifford hoisted the doctor inside and shut the door firmly. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the dim interior. John of Gaunt and Princess Joan were smiling at him from the facing bench. So you were behind this, Wyclif said to the Duke. No, it was Joan, he insisted. She told me about the Pope's letter and urged me to intervene. She leaned forward in a rustle of silk and patted Wyclif's knee. I didn't want you to lose your head, Doctor. He bowed as best he could in the seat. You are too gracious, Princess. Perhaps we should call you the fair and benevolent Maid of Kent. Your life is safe for now, but the council has forbidden you to teach, said the Duke. What will you do? I'll ignore them, cried Wyclif. It is like the prophet Jeremiah said, the truth is a fire shut up in my bones. Well, we'll try to protect you, prophet, but perhaps you should stop referring to the Pope as the Antichrist. Joan's eyes twinkled. Let Courtenay and the others do what they may, retorted Wyclif. If I can't teach at Oxford, I'll find a street corner where I can preach, and I'll continue to help my former students with their English translation of the Bible." He shut his eyes and propped his bare feet against the cushions. "With the psalmist, I say, I will not die, but live, and declare the works of the Lord." "Yes, but first," said the Duke, wrinkling his nose, "let's get you a bath and a pair of shoes. Even a humble priest should have one pair, Wyclif." He stuck his head out the door. "To the Savoy, driver." The carriage lurched into motion, and then they pulled away from the dock with a muddy splash. Pope Gregory died a few days after Wyclif's trial, but it was several months before word arrived in England, and even longer before they heard that two rival popes were fighting to take his place. William Courtenay became Archbishop of Canterbury. John Wyclif continued to write against the abuses of the Church, with the protection of the Duke of Lancaster. The frail doctor's health declined, and he died from a second stroke on December 28, 1384. But the Bible translation he supervised circulated throughout England, and his call for reform spread across Europe. At the Council of Constance, long after his death, the Church officially declared him a heretic. They dug up his body and burned it, scattering his ashes into a river.